Hi everyone, and welcome to this short video explaining how I go about choosing a colour palette before I begin to work. This is something that I've almost always done because I find it gives me a few moments just to sit with the photo reference and really analyse it and think about what colours I might use. It also helps speed up my process these days, as when I hit record on the camera, it does help me to have some colours already sitting here so that I'm not having to waste time pulling out drawers, having a look in all of my different colour palettes. It helps me a lot and focuses my intentions for the painting before I start to paint. And it's something that I do recommend that you give a try because it really helps you organise your colours. Think about colour harmony before you get really bogged down with the actual task of putting pastel on the paper. So I'm going to give you a few quick tips in this video and also just explain how I chose the palette for this piece in particular. Many of you have asked for some help with people portraits in particular, and I agree. I think it's particularly hard to choose colours for skin tones and portraits. So let's have a closer look at this particular palette. So I did pretty well when choosing this palette of colours. These were all the colours that I laid out for myself before I started the painting. And actually I chose a few too many colours because I had these ones down the side which I didn't use at all. So I didn't end up picking up any extra colours during this piece. What I chose at the start actually did do the whole portrait. So I'm obviously getting better at choosing the palettes before I start. It does take a bit of practice. So I'm going to quickly explain how I actually go about choosing the palette. And really it's just about focusing on the photo reference and having a good look at all of my pastels and seeing what might work. But the first thing that I really want to do is have a good close-up look at the photo reference. So that's why I like to work off a computer screen, because you can zoom right in on the photo reference. And the first thing that I tend to look for are the darkest areas. So anywhere, pretty much like my painting process, the darkest areas. So the hair, for example, I did actually give myself one of the Unison blacks, CB2. Thinking that I might use it to block in more of the hairline a bit more quickly, but in the end I used my trusty Faber-Castell black. So I didn't really need the softer black pastel. Other than that, I'm looking at these darker areas, so I know that I'm going to need possibly some very dark browns. And BE6 is a wonderful choice because it's got a lot of warmth to it as well. I did actually choose out a cooler dark brown as well, which in the end I didn't really need because I wanted to keep a lot of the warmth in the skin tone. So I did actually choose out both a cooler brown and a warmer brown to get me started. Obviously when you're looking at skin tones like this, a slightly darker type of skin tone, you're thinking a lot of deeper browns. So this colour in particular, which I can really see in the warmer areas on the creases of the face. And something that I actually do is pick up the pastel and hold it up to your computer screen or to your photo, whatever you have. So actually pick up the pastel and hold it next to the areas where you think you can see that colour. So I will often do that, actually pick up the pastel piece and hold it next to those areas. So obviously a selection of browns for this. That's the obvious choice. I can see this kind of tone running down the mid-tone areas. So we're starting to come into the mid-tones. So I first of all think of my dark tones. That's my first port of call. Then into the mid-tones, I'm thinking about those other skin tones, something with a bit more peachy red in it. Again, mid-tone browns. But also because of her clothing in this piece, I also had these colours to consider too. And I knew that these colours in particular were going to affect the rest of her skin tones as well. So I chose myself 3 reds, one to give me the darker areas of her shirt, a good mid-tone vibrant red as well to help me with the rest of the colour of her shirt, and also this lighter peachy tone, which really, when you see all 3 of these together, gives you the dark, mid and light. And I knew that all 3 of these would also become very useful within her skin tones. But when you see warm coloured clothing like this, or whatever colour of clothing the person is wearing, then you need to consider how that might affect the skin tones as well. So to me, a lot of these red colours that I can see on the shirt also get reflected into the shadow areas on her neck, underneath her chin. So I know that I'm going to be able to carry through reds like this and make her skin tones much more vibrant just by adding touches of this red. And I also wanted to just quickly mention this BGE, the green shade that I decided to use in this portrait. And I've just dropped in the colour code here for it so that you can maybe start to see some of it. Now this one was a stretch. It wasn't that I was actually seeing lots of this colour in the skin tones. This is where I start to bring in a little bit of colour theory. So knowing that around this part of the face, down this side of the face, around the chin especially, any of the warmer shadow areas has got a lot of red in it, and that's of course partly due to all the reds as we've just discussed in the shirt. So in my mind it would be nice to bring in some greens in the skin tone just to go nicely against the reds, red and green being opposite colours on the colour wheel. So the area where I can see it most is in these cooler shadow parts, and to me they're cooler just because they're not really catching the light, they're not really showing much warmth. And just if we follow the brow line down the side here, just where you saw me add these small areas of this green, just down this side of the face, right next to all of that lovely red area down the side of the face also, and perhaps in here above the lip on the shadow side, and around this bottom part of the lip on the shadow side too. So that was my thinking in bringing in this lovely subtle green. It's not a really vibrant bright green, but even just a touch of that really enhances the skin tones. So that's a lot of the mid-tones that I've been thinking about. Then working my way up towards the highlights, so anywhere that I can see the highlights. Obviously this side of her face is the brightest part of her face. So with those highlights where the light is coming directly on that side of the face, I know that I'm going to need some warmer tones over there. So before jumping straight to my brightest highlight, for example, a little bit of this brown earth colour for in under the eye here where it's catching the light, areas like this in between the highlight area and the more shadow areas. So this is a good in between. Also then a brightest highlight like the grey 27 and even a little bit of my grey 28, the 2 lightest values. So I was thinking that I was going to need some of those brightest highlights down this side of the face, this side of the nose, this area on the nose, and this part of the chin, anywhere where that brightest light is hitting. But then on the other side of the face, to counter that, we've also got highlights over here too. This side of the nose, here and here, this part of the cheek, this lovely shiny area on the eyebrow, this side of the face. We do have some light coming from this side of the face, but it's much cooler. It's nowhere near as bright as over here. So that's the sort of thing that I'm really analysing when I'm looking at the photo reference. So I decided to bring in some blue tones for those cooler highlights, and that's something that you often see me do. It's a classic move from me to bring in some dusky blue tones to work as highlights on this side of the face. So I chose myself a lighter grey mid-tone with a bit of blue violet in it. I believe this is grey 9, I can't quite remember from the colour list. And also my BV7, which is going to make a great, slightly brighter highlight on here, but still so much cooler than my grey 28. So we've got warm highlights and cool highlights. So I've really just worked my way up the face from dark tones through to mid-tones through to my highlight colours. Then lastly, just for the lips, for example, I knew that they were going to be quite difficult. There's a lot of different colours going on in there. I thought I would probably make use of some of my darker browns for those areas, but I was also seeing a sort of purple tone to those. So when I actually held this one up to the lips, I could see a lot of that colour coming through. So top tip really is to pick up your pastels, hold them up to your photo reference, really hold it next to it and see if it matches. And I promise, given some time, your eye just gets better at seeing these colours and how they relate to the photo reference. So just to show you exactly what I do when I am analysing my photo reference, I'll show you now. So you can see that I've got some drawers surrounding me while I work. So I've got some of my little pastel boxes here. And one of the great benefits of organising my pastels into these colour categories is that it makes choosing my colours out much easier. So for example, when I'm first looking at the photo reference and I'm deciding that I need some dark browns, all I've got to do is pick out my main tray of mid-tone and dark browns, and then I can start choosing some of these, holding it next to the photo reference, seeing if that works. But really, when I'm thinking about one colour in particular, then I focus on that one colour until I pick out a few that I think might work. And then of course with this piece, I also have some pastel pencils to think about. And for me, that's usually quite easy once I've chosen my soft pastel palette, because I'll normally choose a few colours in the pastel pencil range that match what I've got in the soft pastels. So definitely a black or two. Sometimes I set myself out two and get them nicely sharpened up so that I don't have to pause and sharpen pencils. With this one, also a good dark brown I chose to go along with some of the dark browns and help me with some of the creases in the face, for example. Also a good warm brown tone. Again, for some of those creases on the face, especially just for the finer details. I also chose myself out a blue to go along with some of my blue highlights, just in case I would need to add some little fine highlights, for example around the eye when it's in shadow. And then three of the light tones that I use in almost all of my pieces, and that is pure white, a cream sort of off-white with a touch of yellow in it, and then an off-white with a touch of blue in it. So again, we've got the lightest version, then a warm and a cool. So you can see a pattern forming here. I'm often thinking of lights, mid-tones and darks, and both warm and cool. But all of these pretty much just mimic what I've got in the tray. But I'm gonna show you a couple of extra tricks now using Photoshop. And if you're just starting out and you're still really struggling to see the colours in a photo reference, then these two tricks are going to help you a lot. So if you've got Photoshop or something similar, some kind of free editing software on your computer, you may well have these tools on that as well. But if you're using Photoshop, you'll be able to follow along exactly what I do here. So once you have your photo reference in your photo editor, The first tip that I have for you is to play around with the saturation. So just selecting the photo and going into adjustments and then hue and saturation. And I'm going to play with the saturation here. So if we take the saturation right down, it brings our photo into grayscale, so you can't see any colors. So back to normal. My tip really is to start and raise the saturation and see what extra colors the computer decides to bring out of the photo reference. So I'm not saying to paint it from this version of the photo, so don't leave the saturation up, but even just bringing it up for a second or two and then back down to the normal level. To me, my eyes can still see a lot of that vibrant color when you come back down. It just points out where there are extra colors that maybe you're not seeing from the photo reference itself. So I'm going to show you another quick example of that just to really highlight what that can do. Many of you will recognize my owl photo reference from the other paint along demo. So if we play with the saturation on this one, first of all, let's just look at these shadow areas. Maybe you're really struggling to see why I added blue into this shadow, why I added greens into the shadow. Maybe it just looks grey to you at the minute. So let's play with the saturation. First of all, let's see what it really looks like if those shadows were grey. So that's them when they are truly grey. This is it at normal. Already a lot more color in there, but if you really want to make it obvious to your eyes and start to train your eyes to see more color, can you see when I bring that saturation up just how blue this area along the left side of the owl goes, and just how much green comes into the shadows clearly from all of that reflected green around it. So again, I'm not saying to paint it from that version of the photo, bring it back down to normal, but I guarantee that your eyes will now see more colour in those shadows where before they might have looked grey. And my final colour tip using Photoshop is to use the colour picker or the eyedropper tool, as it's called here. And this is literally a little eyedropper that when you click it on any part of the photo reference, it will bring up the flattened JPEG of that color. So let's go into some of the darkest area here. So I chose out my BE6, didn't I, for this? And that really does look like BE6 in some of those darker areas. So you can literally see the color sample isolated from the rest of the photo reference. And again, maybe a bit more red or plum to that, a bit more pink, but again, BE6 is a pretty good choice. And also for in these darker areas on the face, we've got that BE6 sort of color there. Another area, perhaps some of the mid-tone areas. So this looks like one of my red earth colors that I chose. Let's have a look on the lips, for example. That really looks like the BE23 color that I chose for the lips. So this is a great tool if you're just starting out and you're really struggling to see the exact colors within a photo reference. This magical little color tool here, the eyedropper or the color picker, really will help you in isolating some of the colors. And I guarantee that what you're going to find is it's nearly always darker than you think. And that's something that I'm always saying, but it's nearly always darker than you think. So again, into the darker side of the face, we're into really dark browns down this, which sometimes your eye just doesn't pick up on that stuff. So that's two of my best tips if you've got Photoshop or something similar. Play about with the saturation, and also play about with the eyedropper tool. But quite honestly, although these are all great tips and tricks that I made use of in the beginning too, soon you will find that you don't need these. I didn't use those to choose this palette out. Your eye just gets better over time at seeing the right colours. And I don't always see the right colours. As I said, often I pick out a palette at the beginning, but then I've got to choose more colours as I'm painting. I realise that I haven't thought of some colours that I do actually need. But just taking the time to choose this basic palette at the beginning really gets you going on the right track. It's something that I wouldn't start painting before having done nowadays. So I hope that this information really helps you better analyse the photo reference that you're about to paint. This applies not just to people portraits, but to all the photo references that I work from. I'm looking firstly for the darks, the mid-tones and the highlights that I might need. And I'm thinking about the lighting direction and the lighting effects in the photo reference. Will I need both warm versions of those colours and cool versions? And that's really it in a nutshell. If you can get a basic palette in your tray before you start, I think it helps you paint in a more focused and organised way. And whether you have a giant collection of pastels or just a very small basic selection of pastel colours at the moment, it doesn't matter. If you can eventually get them organised into some kind of colour order, that's going to really help you access your colours more quickly and always know where certain tones are when you need them. So although I'm not the most organised person in the world, when it comes to my pastel colours, I really try to be, because in the long run, it makes my life a lot easier. So I hope that you've picked up some useful tips from this and that you will be able to choose yourself a better palette of colours before you start to paint next time. And until next time, happy pasteling.